Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. I'm here with Paul. Paul, welcome to the show.
Hello, thanks for having me. And I like how you pronounced my name there.
I always say it like that. It's just the word Paul, though. It's not with any Joes. It's not with any Tims. It's only Pauls.
I don't actually like my name.
Why?
Because, well, I think it's got something to do with where I grew up in the north of England. And, you know, when people say Paul, it's just sort of it's a plosive followed by a sort of meaningless drawl. So it's sort of Ball. And I was named after Paul McCartney as well, which doesn't help.
My fucking name is Robbie Robertson. That's a joke.
Happy to hear
most,
that. No,
it's a joke to most people. Like a cop,
it's lovely.
I gave my full name one time to a cop when I was like 14, 15 years old. And he goes, "What's your real name?" And I was like, "That's my real name." And he just didn't believe me. And probably still doesn't believe me. But I mean, it's just, I don't know. Maybe my parents loved me, hated me. I have no clue.
So what this is probably going off in a direction you didn't anticipate, but I'm very curious why you were talking to a cop.
Because I was 14. I was doing dumb stuff, skateboarding around. Apparently, there was a no skateboarding sign I didn't see, or they were hiding it somewhere. So I'm not a bad person. I
can see that. You look like a very nice chap.
I try and keep a good appearances, I would say. But in my free time, I like to, I don't know, scroll through the dark realms of the internet like any other person does.
I'll leave a silence there.
Paul, please introduce yourself to everyone out there listening.
Okay, lovely. I'm p.craddock. I am a cultural historian of medicine. I wrote a book called Spare Parts, which is a history of transplant surgery from the 16th century to the present day. And that comes out, well, it's out now in the UK, but it's out in America, in North America, in May. Yeah, it came out in August, here, and it's out in America in May.
And why specifically did you get involved in something like this? Like, I mean, I would say death history, right? Like, in a sense, I mean, it's surgery and you say transplant. I start thinking as organ transplants, but then that takes me down the weird dark rabbit hole of organ harvesting and the Birkenhair murders and kind of like the darker realms than probably what you wrote about.
I have a different perspective on organ transplants, I think. Because when I talk about this book to people, they generally assume that I'm either a surgeon or I've had a transplant, and they sort of say, either something like "well done" for being a fantastic surgeon, saving lives, etc., or "you poor thing, you must be very grateful," that kind of thing. And I feel like answering, well, yes, I am a poor thing, but it's nothing to do with transplant surgery. So I've come to that subject through, I suppose, a more general interest in history. And, when I started to think about it, I was attracted to this picture of a student called Jennifer Sutton. And if you look her up, you'll get an image of her looking at her own heart, which is in a museum case. So I thought that was very, very powerful image. Obviously, it spoke of a kind of a kind of a regard and respect for the medical, I suppose, profession. But also it was very, very powerful in that, it was an impossible situation to see a woman staring at her own heart. And it brought up questions for me that I suppose everybody in some way encounters at some point or another. What does it mean to have a body? If you're staring at a part of it that, you should need to stay alive. What does it mean to be human? And all these very, very deep philosophical questions. And that my book doesn't answer those questions, obviously. But they sort of made me think about what it means to transplant. And a lot of the stories about transplant start with something like Christian Bernardino, the heart transplant, 1967, the first human heart transplant, which is usually depicted as a kind of a race. But there's a reason that's sort of a powerful story, and two reasons. One of them is that in the 60s, when that was taking place, hospitals and doctors started to get really, really into PR, telling their own stories. Another reason is because it's a post-war period, and that kind of optimistic story of a heroic surgeon, usually almost exclusively a man, became very, very popular. Because stories of that kind were very, very popular then. It's not the only time in history when hero narratives were popular, but it certainly it was one of the reasons underpinning the popularity of that story. And I sort of thought, if I can not go with that hero story, and I can look at what transplants are and how far back I can find a transplant, I might be able to tell a different story that doesn't set everything in orbit around this, this massive heart transplant event. So I looked as far back as I could, and there were skin grafts in ancient India. There were blood transfusions in the 17th century between animals and humans. Human teeth were sold in the 18th century. Children were cajoled into giving up their teeth so that they could be used to improve the smiles of richer and older ladies and gentlemen.
Oh my
God. It's quite heavy stuff, and I see that as an analog, or I don't know about precursor, but certainly an analog to that organ harvesting trade that you mentioned. It sounds like it's not quite as serious, but it isn't quite as serious, I don't suppose. But you're basically engaging in abuse when you ruin the face of a child for the sake of a more elderly, richer person.
Well,
and sorry, go on.
Well, I would say, what really kind of shocks you doing like some of your, like, at least digging back that far, besides like the horror that kind of comes with it? Because honestly, I think it's the time period we live in now. Like, for you being interested in that, I would only probably come across people that would be willing to stomach a photo or anything back then. Like, I think it was Dr. Lindsay Fitzharris who got me interested into the topic, but her Instagram is a fun follow. Her Twitter's a fun follow. Because she posts amazing pictures and models of things from like way back in the day. Like, there was a woman who was having twins, but the stomach was split open so you could see it. And I think everyone has a natural curiosity of what it was like back then, how far medical advancements, and it honestly makes you be appreciative of what we have today. I mean, the fact that medical science has gotten so advanced to where we don't have to really worry about a lot of issues, at least not compared to back then. But I mean, people don't like to see it today. And whenever I come across people that do like to see it, it's usually they have some like interest, that whether they go deep diving down and they realize like like, I guess not really the amazing part to it, but more like just how fascinating it tends to be. Like, people on the cusp of trying to figure things out. Like, the one that makes me cringe the most, and the one that I really kind of like think is interesting, is how they used to break up kidney stones by taking a needle and a hammer and cracking it out, basically, or breaking it up into small bits that way. That just freaks me out, makes any guy cringe, I'm pretty sure. But I'm
crossing my legs.
It's the start of something and where we're at today, where you really kind of take hold and it makes you appreciate a little bit more. But in today's time, people don't want to see blood. They can't stomach it. There's just a whole kind of dismay, I would say, than back how it used to be back in the days where it was a show. People would go and pay and watch something
Yeah.
like in a theater act. And now people don't want to see it. People want to be like, I want to be knocked out. It's like, you don't want to be awake for your baby's birth. No, I want to be knocked. I want out. I want out. You're like, but it's back then they
Yeah.
didn't have that. They didn't, I mean, I think it was like, what is it? The 1890 something. They started inventing that anesthetic or anesthesia type thing.
Don't quote. Well, I said don't quote me unless I'm being recorded. I think it was. I think it was earlier than that. I think
You are on the record, sir.
I think it was the. Oh, I'm going to show myself up if it's wrong, but I think it's around the 1860s.
But it really kind of, to me, was always a little bit interesting ever since I first heard Dr. Lindsay Fitzharris talk about it on a Joe Rogan podcast, and I've followed her ever since, because it's a whole other side of the world that nobody gets to see. It's kind of like the stepchild that you keep in the basement that nobody ever wants to talk about. It's like, well, he's still there. It's still a person, but it's a dark side of history because people don't like death. Death is always associated as bad, and sometimes death is a point where it's supposed to be bad, but it's also a point of, I guess, revelation in a sense, not for the person that's dying, but for the person that's going through grief or dealing with emotion. There's a whole other side to it that really doesn't get talked about. And sadly, the industry has just now been littered with people that want to market it. I mean, funeral coffins. Costco used to sell coffins in the middle of there. Like, people would just go in there, like, you want to, if they're coming close to that day, you never know. It's like, it's just been marketed in such a sense that it's not really talked about in the same wholeness, I would say, as it probably was back in the day. Now, I might be wrong. This is just my thoughts about this type topic.
There's a few things that came up there. I suppose they something completely unrelated, I suppose. But my dad's a funeral director.
There we go. That's where the connection is.
Well, I've not seen him in action for many years, but I remember him taking me to a place in Hertfordshire, I think it was, to go and buy some headstones or something. And they're very strange people, the people who sell headstones. Have you ever met any of them?
No. Did they come up to you and like prick you and like, grab a little bit of your blood and be like, oh, we can make a little, how tall are you? 6'2", 6'1"?
No, they don't. Well, I'm generalizing from just a few headstone salespeople, but they tend to be really impressed by technology. I remember one of them, and this was sort of, this was after the millennium. This was about 2002, and he thought I'm going to impress this boy, and he pointed to a phone on his desk and he dialed the number and he said, "See that phone? It's ringing in Japan now. It's ringing in Japan." And he thought that would impress me. And it's just completely mad.
What? I have no idea what just happened. That just threw me through a loop. I was thinking about we're talking about never mind.
No, I thought I'd throw you a curveball.
You did 210 miles an hour, toss me off to the side.
Another thing I was going to ask you actually, are you squeamish? Because I've lost all idea of what that means now.
I thought I wasn't, but my buddy, what he does for a living is he makes cosmetic surgery videos, and he goes, "You just want to see a little bit of my work?" And he sent me a picture of someone getting like their eye had popped out of their head and getting it shoved back into their head. And that one made me a little bit cringy. But with most things, I don't think I am, but there's always something that always pushes a new boundary. I just think you have to kind of like expose yourself to it to the point where you become numb from it. And I think you do that a lot with, especially like what you deal with as well too. Like, I mean, you're looking through old pictures and digging through the past. A lot of them isn't going to be fun. Putting skin on another person's skin is a little bit different, but it happens. It's a real thing.
Yeah, I feel like, because this is what you originally asked me about, really, I suppose. I feel like I've become quite numb to that kind of thing.
Does that scare you?
But then, no, but the fact it doesn't scare me scares me a bit. But I've met a war artist, and he used to paint medical scenes in Iraq and Afghanistan. So he'd go out and paint, these medical tents. So he'd seen some horrific things. But I met him at a surgical reenactment, and it was basically a plastic abdomen, and inside it was a pig's gallbladder, and it was a surgical reenacting the removal of removal of the gallbladder, actually, and how they used to do it, before keyhole surgery. So making a slit, taking it out, and he fainted. Oh, that's very, very strange. I mean, this man has seen some of the most horrific injuries, and he's seen people sort of, mess with open wounds, sort of manipulating body parts at close quarters. He's focused on it so intensely in order to paint these things. But then he sees a plastic abdomen and a pig gallbladder, and he faints.
I think everyone's got an Achilles heel. Like I could watch someone get their whole nose blown off or their arm blown off and it wouldn't bother me. But when I see a broken finger, it makes my legs turn into jello in a sense. It's just that
Yeah.
though. It's just fingers. It's when I see the finger that's not
Oh,
straight
that's
anymore and it's
interesting.
completely broken off to the side. Like there's a movie with Rob Schneider, and he's in a prison, and some big dude comes up to fight him and he beats up the big guy, but then he grabs the dude's hand and he breaks
Yeah.
every single one of his fingers. I can't watch that part.
Yeah.
That part just gets me. It makes me go, because it's when even if it's a fake hand and I know it's a fake hand, it's just that's a real possibility.
Yeah.
If anybody's ever jammed their fingers or hurt their finger in such a sense, I mean, that is, and it's just, I don't know, it just seems fragile in a sense.
No, I get that. For me, it's eyes, when you talked about the eye hanging out.
Oh, I picked the perfect one then. That was great. That was a good
Yeah.
example. You know
I
what's
can't
weird
look at
though
that.
is that there's a museum in I think it's California. It's called the Bodies Exhibit. Have you ever heard of that?
Right?
So
No, I don't think I have.
it's a popular, like people pay to go see this thing. It shows you all the inside of the organ systems. They got like baby fetuses and like little test tube type thing so you can see them.
Yeah.
And then they literally show you the whole human anatomy basically. But people will pay to go see that. But the craziest thing I found out about it is that they're unclaimed bodies. They're bodies that were like with bullet holes in them. And it's like, I feel like that isn't right. And that's when we talk about like the profitization of death. Like I feel like everyone should know what that is. And if someone wants to donate their body to science, good. But when you're like, you got Russian immigrants, you got Chinese immigrants that probably died in some horrific way that are now being displayed all for the aspect of science, but someone's paying a $12.50 ticket to get in, and then it's $6.50 on Tuesdays for the kids. Like that just, to me, that just seems a little bit edgy. And I think
I agree.
The amount of people that probably go to that is because there's a giant interest in people wanting to know how our bodies work. I mean, I'm still fascinated with the fact that every day that you can wake up, that's luck to me. Your lungs could just stop working at any moment. Something could just go wrong. I had a friend recently just have emergency gallbladder surgery. Like it's a random thing where something just stops working. And I think that increases wonderment and idea of understanding where and what and how things work and how far we've come in a sense. I mean, what is it? Robert Liston and Joseph Lister. Those two guys, like those are heroes in my mind. And people go, what? The guy who invented Listerine? I was like, well, I mean, in a sense, you're kind of right, but more like he just kind of figured out like, oh, we should just start washing off our tools instead of just letting the blood fly everywhere. Even though it wasn't warm water, he just kind of rubbed water over it. That's, to me, I like to look at history and I like to see every single person who's an innovator or someone who's thinking differently, because I think that's the same thing with like conspiracy people today. Like conspiracies can go too far, but there are some people that are thinking about things like Epstein. Nobody would have predicted that, but that someone thought about it and started doing an investigation. Next thing you know, it's true, whether you're paranoid or not. It's just the exclusiveness and thought. Like people feel like we have a narrative that we're going to run by. I'm like, well, what happens if the Earth wasn't just hit by one asteroid, it was hit by multiple? I mean, there's hypotheses about that all the time. And I'm like, whether you call that fringe science or pseudoscience or say that scientist is crazy, it's those innovators throughout history, those people that question the narrative and are always thinking differently. It's why I'm so open to so many perspectives, is because I feel like you don't have to choose one that best fits you. Just be open to them all and realize that everything that we know is what we go by, but everything that we know could also be wrong in a sense when more information about our past or where we come from or whoever comes out. I think that's the most important thing. Talking to someone like yourself, you're doing a major, besides the book Spare Parts, you're doing a major, I would say, benefit to society in just a sense of you're educating people in a way that you feel like your voice can educate others. I mean, that's with anybody doing anything. And that's a very important role in the history of the world.
That's very kind.
I was blowing a
Thank you.
little bit of smoke up your ass, but
Well, we have got a picture, haven't we? What would you say a hero? You're interested in, I suppose, heroes and innovators in a sense.
I'm interested in everything.
That's fantastic. I like that. I like that answer. You see, part of a reason that the story of transplant surgery is so compelling to me, the longer story that is, the story that I tell in Spare Parts, is that in a sense, I mean, I am, of course, celebrating these innovators, of course, and I'm telling their stories, but in a sense, I'm subverting that story of the mid-20th century heroic surgeon. I don't think you've read the book yet, have you?
Spare Parts?
Yeah.
No.
Well, it's not out in your area.
You got to send me a signed copy when it comes out.
Of course I've got, in fact, I can show you.
Can I get a black and white headshot of you holding a rose?
Of course you can. I'll hold whatever you want.
Don't say that.
Yeah, I'll hold whatever you want. But here I'm holding now. This is the
UK version.
galley. No, this is the US version. The galley of the US version. It's got a different. I'll get the UK version.
I love that art style, don't you?
I think this is very good. Hang on.
I'm about to say how long is?
I can't hear you because I've got my headphones on.
I was about to say, how long is that headphone cord? Good God.
Not as long as it needed to be in order for me to hear what you just said. That's the UK hardback.
That looks better.
It's also got a different subtitle. I think they've both got very good in different ways. This is called Spare Parts, A Surprising History of Transplants. The paperback UK one is called An Unexpected History of Transplants. The US one, I can never remember because I didn't come up with it. It was The Story of Medicine Through the History of Transplant Surgery, which is, I quite like the fact that that's, more bombastic almost. It's doing everything. I would never say that my book tells the whole story of medicine, obviously, but I think it's an interesting way to frame it.
Well, people in the US just love like books or anything that seems like it's giving you the answer to everything all in one. So they just don't feel like they have to go out and spend more money.
Well, this in a sense does give you that answer to everything in the world of transplant surgery. But what I was going to say about this book and the hero narrative,
okay, is
that I tried to subvert that sort of everything put in orbit around the 60s thing by looking at an embroiderer called Marianne Larudier. Now, most people have never heard of this person. She was an embroiderer in 19th century Lyon in France. And she was an amazing embroiderer. She did the curtains, she did the gold embroidery on the curtains of the Paris Opera House. She won competitions, massive competitions in the Chicago Exposition. Her work is in the collection of the Vatican. So it's just a big deal. And the person who we give credit to for inventing the technique to sew organs into bodies. His name is Alexei Carrel, and she was his teacher. Excuse me, I'm not, this, it sounds like I'm getting emotional. Actually, I've just got something stuck in my throat.
Well, that makes sense, because I mean, if you can put a patch on a jacket, you would think you could just transfer the same thing, especially when it comes to like skin, for instance. I would look at like the best sewing person back then would probably be someone who's would be really good at healing up wounds in a sense, because you already got the basic tools for the craft. You just need to transfer them over to a different form of art.
Well, the thing is with Larudier, I worked with, and this was a bit of original research in peer-reviewed journals, so it's proper. I worked with an embroiderer, and I reenacted Alexei Carrel's technique to sew blood vessels into bodies. So it was an innovation.
Did you say blood vessels?
Yeah.
Holy shit! That, you know
So
how hard that is?
together, you need to. I've got an idea of how hard it is, and I can't even thread a bloody needle. So it's nothing I can do, which is why I had to work with an
I
embroiderer.
can't even imagine doing that.
Well, I don't know what to say to that, because I can't either. It's extremely difficult. And what they used to do in medical schools at that time, this is turn of the 20th century, so 1900, 1901, they used to practice on cigarette papers, because cigarette papers are very, very thin and flimsy and they tear easily. And that's a clue, because in order to make some kind of intervention, I suppose you could say, into something as thin and flimsy as a cigarette paper or an artery, you have to have a certain set of skills. And those skills are not generally practiced or known by domestic seamstresses or people who sew for a living, or the wives and sisters and mothers who taught the surgeons. They wouldn't have that kind of technique. So I wondered what that technique comprised of. And anyway, I worked with this embroiderer, and together we found a few very specific elements of this technique that were shared between the surgical procedure and can be found in the objects that this embroiderer made. So it seems that technique to sew organs into bodies, that foundational technique of transplant surgery, at least in part came from French embroidery. So we should also, as well as celebrating that man, Alexei Carrel, we should also be celebrating that woman, Marianne Larudier.
Now, so you feel like your book highlights this?
Well, it certainly does. That's in fact, the original draft of the book ended with that story.
So, okay, so if I was going to ask you with your book, where do you find that you stick around through, because you could go through anything throughout all your research or all your history deep diving, what do you find you stick around the most? Do you stick around a specific section timeline? Do you stick around a certain surgery in general? Do you stick around a certain innovation that happened, or you tend to just cover up the grand scheme? But I know you got a harper on just one a little bit more.
When you say stick around, what do you mean?
Like you can see the time period, whichever one you.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Well, it runs from the first dated bit is 1549, and that's when transplant surgery enters modern medicine.
And that starts with the skin transplants.
It starts with skin transplants. It starts with a very eccentric and strange Italian surgeon basically stealing a technique from an Italian peasant family who developed it from, whose family and, other surgeons of that type developed it from agricultural techniques. So it started out as a way to graft apples onto, apple trees and things.
And that's what you started with, and so
Yeah.
it doesn't stick around there, so you go on to something else, you keep going down the timeline. So
Yeah. So that's
that
the
one,
first.
well, that one didn't pique your curiosity then. That one wasn't interesting enough, like, because for me, I would stay right on that and I would not leave that. I would try
Well,
and do like a kind of a biography in a sense.
there's a good deal of it actually. Um, the first chapter, which is, I've got the book here. I can tell you how long it is. So up until page 49, you're on that skin grafting story. And then we go to blood transfusions in animals, which is sort of a next stage of that history, and blood transfusions between animals and humans after that. And then it goes in a timeline, and there's almost no break actually until you get to the early 19th century, and that's the time when transplant surgery becomes, for the first time, an altruistic thing. It comes to be about saving lives.
Do you see what I'm trying to kind of source out here is which one really kind of made you want to stay on it longer? Like if that first one you started
Okay.
on makes 49 pages, I'm looking for the one that's an extra couple of pages. That means you like that story a little bit more than all of the others. It makes your eyes light up when you get interested into it. You know what I mean? Like for me, if you want to talk about like anything to do with death history or any type of topic back then, I would probably stick around Robert Liston and Joseph Lister, just because they're two surgeons that seemed like they were way above. So I would make a book. Most of it would be about that rather than just going on to the other people who were working on like, the reason like big wigs, the reason why they had white wigs was because of syphilis, but everyone now considers it like royalty or some type of fancy thing. Like that is interesting to me, but I just like the single person. So if you started with the first one that's 49 pages and it talks about skin transfusion, then you go over to like a blood transfusion, you're hitting the topics. I'm just wondering, which one did you stick on the most, the one that really got you like, oh, this is the one that I need to talk about a lot more?
Well, the one I need to talk about a lot more is that Larudier case, actually, because I think it changes the story that we tell about that longer history. So a lot of that book it does have it's about individuals, and there are a lot of quite in-depth stories. But I like to see those in-depth stories as part of a much wider and more significant historical landscape. So it's quite an epic book in that sense.
So you're thinking like the Coen brothers,
The Coen brothers.
the guys who wrote, you ever see the Ballad of Buster Scruggs?
No, I've not.
It's on Netflix. It's a really good movie. But what it is, it's one movie, but it's multiple movies in one. So like the first one you have is like an Old West style thing about a guy named Buster Scruggs. And then the second one, there's like Liam Neeson playing a role in it. And then it's like, it's all these mini stories unfolding into one giant movie, basically. So you're just like, I remember I fell asleep. Like it was like, you need to take those 5-minute naps. I fell asleep and I thought I woke up like 4 hours later and I was watching a different movie. It was the same movie, but it was a different part in the movie that was a whole nother movie inside of one. So it's like 6 movies in one, and each one is like 25 minutes. There's Liam Neeson's part is he's like one of those people that back in the old West days that would set up like one of those stands where you can watch someone perform or something. And it's a guy with no arms and legs, and he's reciting like some type of poetry, old school style, like poetry. And after a while, he's getting a little bit of money, collecting the money. He's carrying this guy around, helping him pee because he can't pee on his own, helping him eat because he can't eat on his own. Then eventually he pulls into a town and a person has a stand, and there's a chicken that's able to guess the number that you want to pick. And everyone's attracted to that rather than listening to the other guy recite poetry or something like that. So then the dude buys the guy's chicken, and then they're going up to the top of this bridge, and Liam Neeson grabs the guy with no arms and legs, sets him down, and then walks over to the thing, throws a rock off the bridge, sees if it sinks, and then he throws the next thing you know, the next shot is you see this Liam Neeson and the chicken. He threw the guy off the thing, which is supposed to, but that was just one scene, one movie part. Then it leads on to a whole different story about a gold miner who's looking for gold. And the minute he finds gold, someone shoots him in the back. And then the guy thinks he's dead, sits there, waits. It's like, it's a bunch of tales in one. That's kind of what your book is. It's a bunch of tales, a timeline.
Yeah,
like
but they connect. Do they connect? Do these stories connect?
Not really. They're more like separate in their own. They're just kind of interesting things where you're just like, what the hell's going to happen next?
No, oh, right. Okay. Well, no, these ones in spare parts absolutely connect.
Okay.
And it's about telling the, you know, we have a very standard story about what transplant surgery is, and it's that race to, you know, have better techniques, and one person sort of trumps another, you know, from the surgeon's perspective, and then you know, the profession of transplant surgery improves. You've got a sort of patient kind of set of narratives alongside that about the patient's experience. Mine is neither of those things. I'd say that it puts them into a historical context so that you can see how that state of affairs, how that kind of story emerged. But it's an epic story. Now, what was I was going to ask you a question, and it wasn't about, it'll come back to me.
Okay. What would you say? Would you say the most interesting thing that you've come across through your research would be the embroider, or is there something else that you particularly find fascinating? It doesn't have to be one that's more interesting to the public. I'm looking for something that's more interesting to you.
That is by far the most interesting thing to me, the embroiderer one, because it
Not the skin
changes that.
transplant.
Well, actually, initially, right? Okay.
You ever see Rob Zombie's House of a Thousand Corpses?
Well,
where she
you're showing me up as a Philistine here. I've not, no.
About to say, the guy that puts on the girl's dad's face, wears his face as a mask, and go, "Who's your daddy? Give me a kiss." That to me scared the living crap out of me, where I'm like, that's what I want to know, is the skin transplant people, like the ones, I mean, we graft skin all the time with burn victims, but if you really think about like back then, how shabbily done was their work compared to now?
Actually, it looked quite convincing.
Damn it.
Oh, it seems to have looked
I'm
quite
over here
convincing.
talking shit.
Well, these early skin grafts, I mean, they've been around. By the time they became part of modern medicine, they've been around literally thousands of years. You know, so they're quite well developed.
I know, but you're dealing with the tools of the time, though. Like, if you look at surgery now, I feel like the whole, like, if we really want to talk about the grand scheme of surgery, like back then, it was more of a reliance on skill and merit that a person has. And it seems like now we have so much technology that does a lot of things for us. Yeah, you still need people in there working the machines and everything like that. But even with surgeries now, like the time on them, like a birth is not even as long as you would think. Before, you'd be like in the hospital for a week. Now it's like you're in there for like what, a couple of hours, and then most of the time you're just sleeping and you're spending up the hospital bill because they keep telling you you're not ready to leave yet.
That's a it seems like a uniquely American problem.
Oh, damn.
The hospital bill going up and up and up. But all right, okay. I'll tell you something that I've not told anybody yet, at least.
Secrets?
You know,
secret time?
Well,
tell me in the whole world. Tell me in the whole world.
Happy to. Spare Parts is a title that I didn't choose. The original title of the book was called Dragon in a Suitcase.
Dragon in a Suitcase.
Yes, and the reason for that, and this gets to what you asked me about, what the most interesting part of this history is. So if I discount the embroiderer, it would be this. Now, I called it Dragon in a Suitcase because I initially had this, I found this story from the early 18th century, 1720s, in an obscure satirical journal called Reed's Weekly Journal, I think it was called, something like that. And it was a story of, if I can remember it now, I've not told this story for literally 3 years, but it was a story of these investors in London who wanted to, for some reason that I forget, bring a dragon into Britain all the way from Syria. And they tried to do this a few times, but the customs officials kept saying, well, this is a dragon, you can't bring this
A Komodo
into
dragon?
no, a giant dragon. Think Puff the Magic Dragon.
Yeah, but they're not real.
Well, set that fact aside for just a moment.
Logic.
So yeah, well, none of this is well, actually, it's perfectly logical. It just bears no relation to anything in the actual world. So anyway, they're bringing this dragon into Britain, and the customs officials just keep saying, no, you can't do that.
Why the hell is he
so
taking customs if he's got a fucking dragon? That thing could just fly over.
Well, you'd think it would fly, wouldn't you? But maybe 18th century dragons didn't.
Is it at least flying first class?
Well,
bottom of the plane.
Well, you see, 18th century dragons clearly couldn't fly if they had to bring them through customs. So I don't know if it would fly first class. But what they did to get around the customs officials is they hired a conjurer, and they sent the conjurer to Libya, and the conjurer chopped the dragon up into little portions, and then they sent each body part through a different port. So they sent the nose through Portsmouth or something, and they floated the tail up the Thames, and the customs officials thought it was part of a museum's collection, so they waved it through. So we got through the customs that way, got it into London, into their offices, and then the conjurer pieced the dragon together again and cast a magic spell and released its vital principle, its life force, from its head, and that connected the body together into a whole again. And it started to wreak havoc. It started to breathe toxic fumes, and people's furniture started to discolor, plants started to die, and people started to worship it because it could transubstantiate coal into money, I think it was. I mean, that's sort of a slimmed down version of it, and probably slightly wrong in the details, but basically it's the dragon stands for the Industrial Revolution coming. So the story was about developing water pumps and early industry. But in telling that story, they employed the notion of transplantation, in the 18th century notion that transplantation happens through a vital principle. This is life itself, which is a particle in the 18th century, in the late 18th century particularly, but it's a particle that circulates around the body in some way through the nerves at first, and then some people thought through the blood. And the idea was that if you can connect a living part, the dragon's head, which still had the vital principle in it, to a dead part, then that principle, that vital principle, life itself, could make its way from one part into another and meld them together. And so the dragon became whole, and it started to live again. That's why I'm glad they made me change the title to Spare Parts, because I'd have to explain that story every time I said, I've got a book called Dragon in a Suitcase.
Where did you get that story from?
It was, Reed's Weekly Journal. Well, when you're a historian, you
I know, but that just sounds older.
Whatever.
That just sounds older than, it sounds like a religious story in a sense. Like, because I mean,
it might have been based on an earlier story.
I through diving down like government projects and stuff like that, you come across some like really nasty stuff. A lot of it kind of harpers around the Nazis in a sense. So I don't want to take us down a completely dark rabbit hole, but Unit 731, if you've ever heard of them, they're way worse than the Nazis. It's kind of like people talk about Hitler, but really there's like Rasputin and other people that have really just killed way more people. But Unit 731 did medical experiments on people. They would do vivisections on people that were alive and time it to see how long the person could still be alive by being sliced down from the bottom all the way up. And what they would do is, you ever see Snowpiercer?
It's just another film on Netflix.
Jesus, man, come on.
Do you know we
Stop watching
we,
Cat Rescue and
we
Netflix it up.
we don't have Netflix because
It's okay. They're changing their subscription to $23.99 a month, and that's just too much money.
it's well, we'll certainly not get that. Well, we you know, there's certain things we want to watch, me and Patricia, and we'd put Netflix on, and then if it's something we want to watch, they want to charge extra. You know, same with Amazon Prime. It's
It's
sort of
pro
whatever it
versions
is.
or something like that, where it's like you
I
can
don't
get
I don't know what it
Netflix.
is.
It's like YouTube did YouTube Premium. It's like, I don't give a shit about ads. You're going to give them to me anyway. I literally saw an ad for the thing I was trying to watch, and I was like, I wanted to
That's
watch a
nice.
movie trailer, and it gave me an advertisement that was the movie trailer. So I got to see it twice. I was like, well, there's no point in skipping it. This is what I wanted to get to anyway. But to the Unit 731 thing, so they did this thing where they would test, and the temperatures over there get freezing cold. It's just Japan.
Mm,
There's like a certain part, like
mm.
it was I mean, snow, worst conditions, horrible. What they would do is that they would take different parts of a person's body while they were alive, have them soak their body part in a certain water that was of a different temperature, and see which one would freeze first while a person was alive. So it's like the movie Snowpiercer, where it's too cold to go outside. So if you stick your arm outside long enough, it just freezes solid and they chop it off. They would do that with Unit 731, but Unit 731 would practice. They would time chopping off your arm, no like medicine to be able to help you out. They just let you do it sober. And then they would try and attach it to the other side of your body. People would do this all the time. The Nazis were well known for it because they would
Mm.
transport organs over and then take organs from other people and try and replace their own with a new person's organ, thinking that it was going to give them a super amount of strength. Actually, if you read some of their textbooks, there's a weird part where it gets into like the magical type stuff a little bit, where they talk about being able to have a person with two hearts, two sets of lungs. As far as I know, nobody survived from it, but it was like this thing that was supposed to give you more strength. It was this more kind of philosophical belief, I would say, just like the Mayans used to have of eating your enemy, you gain their power in a sense. And that to me is fascinating. I mean, the whole history behind it, how far it's kind of come in a way in a more logical basis too. Honestly, they might have been onto something to say you can't do that now. There are people that are able. I think Robin Williams has a joke about it. About he got a heart valve, a new heart valve, and they were giving him a list of valves to choose from. And he was like, well, what do the valves do? He goes, well, we can give a pig valve, a cow valve, a
Yes,
horse
yeah,
valve. And he goes, wait, if I get a cow valve, can I shit standing up? And they were like, no, that's not how it works. But it's like that essential thing of like, do you gain the wisdom from the thing that it was transported
yeah.
from? And that's kind of where the basic concept is.
I came across a novel. It was just called Transplant, and it was just by chance that I came across it in the British Library, and it was published in 1969 or something like that, 1968 and 69. So just after this heart transplant, and it was ridiculous. The um, the plot was basically that this married man is having an affair with a woman, and he has a heart attack or something, and he needs a new heart. And he goes to this hospital, and he gets a choice of what heart to have. And so they offered him a lion heart so he can be braver. And his wife, when he was asleep, said, no, I want the heart of that bitch. Basically. And so he, I can't remember how the hospital justified it in the novel, but they ended up taking the heart out of this woman he was cheating on his wife with and transplanting that into him. And then I think he kills his wife because the heart is somehow the other woman's heart. It's a bit like that.
Well, that's there's
that would be a great film.
There's a
Netflix.
There's a theory, but it's not scientifically proven. But there has been some like rare anomaly cases, but I don't think any science researchers really went down the rabbit hole of it, of people who get an organ transplant and they start getting kind of sensations or cravings of that person. The stories that have been proven false are the ones where people can remember, like you can't get a person's eyes and then be able to see their murder or something like that. It doesn't happen. But there are cases where someone doesn't like sauerkraut, then they get like a kidney or something. Next, they're eating sauerkraut or something that that person used to do. It's kind of like it's genetic memory, which is not like ancestral traits that you can just
Mm.
remember that are, people talk about. It's more about like an organ can kind of be so conditioned to something so much that it does have a sense of craving or an impulse that it will give the new person.
Yeah, it was the Indian woman whose name escapes me now, but I think it was just a couple of years ago on Facebook. She had a hand transplant, so she'd lost her hands in an accident with a bus, and she had her male hands transplanted onto her, and they started to turn into women's hands.
Yeah,
and no one knows why this happens.
Yeah, there's a guy right now. I forgot what I was watching because I had to do a 9/11 episode for episode 9/11. So it's like a 5.5 hour episode. But I got, like I said, down the rabbit hole of algorithms where it led me to a person who got his arms and his legs blown off from war, and they attached new arms onto his arms, and his skin, like he couldn't feel it. But they're like, you might never be able to move your hands, but at least you look, like you have your arms again, kind of in a sense. You just can't really move them. But eventually they were training him physical therapy. He was able to actually like draw, and now he's able to type and everything now too. But he didn't feel it, but he had his arm resting on a stove, and it burned the whole thing up the side of his arm, and he didn't feel it. He doesn't feel pain from it because the nerves aren't attached, because we can't attach nerves. We can only attach certain, like the veins and all those types of things, which, like I said, is fascinating in its own. But the doctors go, at any point, even if you get full control of your arms your body could reject the new arms because it's not lined up with your genetic DNA. It can get used to it, but it's like kind of having shoes that are a size too small. After a while, you just get used to the pain. In a sense, you still need new shoes.
Yeah, the chap who had the first hand transplant, he psychologically rejected his hands, and he stopped taking anti-rejection medication.
Can you imagine looking down at your own hands and being like, these aren't my hands, and just have that imprinted into your brain?
I've tried to imagine it for a long time, and I can't, which is probably why actually it fascinates me, transplant surgery, because it's something that it's an impossible situation. Like we said about, the woman staring at her own heart. It shouldn't happen. You can't imagine it. And the implications of that are major.
Is there one thing that you found out through your research or just work in general that has really disgusted you to where you just can't handle it? Like it's just too much?
When you say disgusted, you mean in the sense of going, ew, or
Like that's horrible. That's the most heinous thing I can possibly think of. Because I mean, we're talking about like kind of the positives in a sense of like organ transplant, but there's the horrible shit that goes with it as well too.
Well, anything before the 19th century was in one way or another horrible.
I know. I'm trying to figure out which one's the most horrible.
The most horrible. Oh, Christ!
I just gave you Unit 731. That's horrible to me.
I know that is horrible. Well, okay, horrible. The most horrible transplant situation I think I've read about would be a blood transfusion between a lamb and a madman. So this is in the 17th century. So, and it was in France. And there is descriptions in scientific papers of this poor animal being dragged into a rich, a chateau, a rich man's, the library of a nobleman in France, Montmort, and being tied down. And there's very descriptions of these anguished cries from this animal, and then almost in the same, and I think it's because it's the same kind of tone of writing, they describe the man being dragged in the same way and being tied down completely against his will.
Okay, so he didn't want it. He was being
Well,
forced.
yeah, it was enforced. He was completely mad. He'd set fire to he used to be a servant. He set fire to his employer's house, and then sort of wandered around Paris naked and set fire to other things. Um,
Does it ever astound you about the fact that a lot of these things that we call innovations, in a sense, it's not, it's like anything in the pursuit of knowledge. Like for me, that's always been fascinating where I like people always go like, I'm a conspiracy person. I'm not really a conspiracy person. I just know what I would do if I was in a position of power in a sense. It's not that I'm a madman or a horrible person. It's just that I think people think just because they don't think that way that nobody's thinking that way. And I think like you got to understand is that with research, with science in general, someone had to be the person that laid the foundation for the pathway. That means whether they had the idea or that means whether they were the person to decide to test it on somebody else. And if
yeah,
you look
that's
all
it. Yeah,
throughout old school history, that's all what it's kind of been. And even now, I mean, to think that there isn't someone out there right now trying to experiment on other people by like, oh, let's see if we can put this in you. It's like everyone's guessing, everyone's trying to figure it out because if it hasn't been done before, there's no knowledge on it. That's why the Nuremberg trials happened. They forgave a bunch of Nazi scientists because they wanted their research. They already did it. There's no reversing the thing. It's all about you have the research. We might as well just forgive you for your crimes and then use your research. Like there's no point doing it all. Everyone's going to want to explore their own pathways. It's kind of like every moment in a person's life, whether you're turning 21 or whether you're a young child, you're going to come across your own path with drugs and alcohol. Everyone has that first experience and everyone's got to lay that foundation for themselves. You can model it off of other people, but you truly have to experience that for yourself. It does not mean everyone needs to go try heroin, but when you take a first sip of alcohol, it kind of is the decipher of your life. And that's with a lot of like innovations. That's with anything that has been stuff that we know about and we're more educated on now is someone had to take that first step.
again, that's a lot of things came up there, but um, sticking with the history, it's very interesting. I'm interested actually why people think you're a conspiracy theorist. First of all,
Because I always like bring up something like about Google or any of these big tech corporations working with each other that eventually are going to form into one giant blob like Google. Google has partnerships with Amazon. Illuminati's real. People go, what do you mean Illuminati's real? I'm like, it's just a bunch of people that found a way to cheat the system. It's called elites, man. Like we all know it's happening, but everyone goes, that's conspiracy talk. I'm like, all right, fucking sorry. I guess I'm a crackhead. I don't know.
well, you seem like a very well put together, intelligent fella to me.
Step over to my basement. You'll see my madness. No, I'm kidding.
No, well, at the very when science became a concept, a workable concept in the 17th century, a lot of these people who were involved in things like blood transfusion were also involved in seriously trying to work out whether different kinds of faith healing worked. And we see faith healing as completely anti-scientific, and I suppose it's fairly safe to draw that conclusion now. But back then, you had no idea. You just saw this a man called Valentine Greatrakes, and he was nicknamed the Irish Stroker because he could cure you of all kinds of things by stroking stroking the humors away and stroking you and sort of basically a kind of faith healing. And you have all of these really eminent scientists that school children now quote: Robert Boyle, John Wilkes, all these very eminent people saying, well, it seems to work. To me, it seems to work. So yeah, faith healing sort of gets a pass of this
It's
particular kind.
it's labeled pseudoscience still if you try and look it up. Mostly
What faith
because
healing is?
yeah, you just need replicated evidence. And even if you have people that go, I definitely feel better, it's like, yeah, well, there's a whole large misunderstanding with science when it goes in basing things in reality and evidence and things that we can see. But there's also a part that we don't see on the cellular level that we can look at through a microscope. But when I talk about like Reiki healing, I fucking hate that. I just really do. It's upsetting when you're like, I'm not touching you, but I'm gonna place my hands above you. And I'm like, get out of my face. I'm trying to enjoy a double cheeseburger and you're ruining it. But with that, I mean, if it's positive vibrations, if it's frequencies, it honestly is like the same feeling I get when I have a conversation with someone. Like we're both afterwards, we're feeling more energetic, we're feeling pepped up. It's stuff that boosts our mood traits in a sense. And I think there's a whole area of study that needs to be focused more particularly on that. And there's probably people out there doing that, but that's why metaphysics is labeled as a category. I mean, there's a academical field where people call it psychological metaphysics, pseudo metaphysics, anything with pseudo. I go, you just can't disable anybody's claims, because just like how we all don't think differently, you need to understand that people might react to things in a different manner, whether it's kind of like the nocebo effect. I don't know if you've ever heard of that.
Nocebo. It rings a bell actually, but tell me.
Placebo probably rings a bell, where they say
Yeah,
this is a
obviously. Yeah, yeah.
this is a pill, it's for your medication, but it's really a sugar pill. Nocebo effect is like the opposite. What happens is that medical professionals give a diagnosis to someone saying you have cancer, and that person starts experiencing cancer symptoms.
Oh, yeah.
They've done autopsies on people and found out that their cancer was benign, or their cancer was like, it wasn't what everyone thought it was, but the person had conditioned themselves to believe that it was so, and literally manifested those things.
Mm.
That can be labeled as a pseudoscience, but in some sense it's true. I mean, you have to understand that people's minds, your psychological aspects, they go so deep, far down the rabbit hole, where I think hypnosis, even though that gets labeled as pseudoscience, in a sense, there's people that stop smoking. Yes, they already want it anyway, in a sense, but there are people that undergo surgeries and do that. I mean, some of them have failed, but there's that small proportion that works. So, I
No,
mean,
it absolutely.
yeah,
I've seen it work. I remember seeing he was a magician, and he
David
convinced.
Copperfield.
No, he was. I've forgotten his name. He wasn't a very nice man, actually. In fact, I remember him being really very rude.
He smelled like
But
cigarettes and
he
brandy.
did actually. Yes, he did. Yeah, do you know him?
No.
Um, but he was giving a seminar to a load of surgeons, and I'm not a surgeon, as I have to keep explaining to people. But I happened to be there because I knew the person running the course, and he just he put one of these surgeons into a kind of a trance, and he convinced him that his hand was in ice water, and it wasn't. It was, he sort of convinced him on some level that his hand was in ice water, and he stuck a needle through it, and he didn't feel a thing. And it's all the power of suggestion. It's amazing.
That's kind of David Blaine stuck an ice pick into his arm, and he reveals how he does it and everything like that too. He's like, you just don't hit any vital organs, but in a sense, it's like numbing yourself. I mean, I think people like, there's the guy, the Iceman. What is his name? William Hoff, I think his name was. He goes out in his underwear in like negative 20-degree weather and
Oh,
meditates.
loads of people do that.
He climbed Everest like without a shirt. Like the man's like, I mean, and people go, that's impossible. Well, he's done it, and there's proof and video of him doing it. It's like, it's real. It's just, what can you get your body to be able to do? I think you can have a lot of people experience a lot of things without having them feel pain or feel anything.
So where you I seem to remember you're in Maine.
No.
Where are you?
Maryland.
Well, began with M, didn't they? All right, never mind that. But there's a group of, I know there's a group of in New York. There's a group of people. They call them the bears or something, or ice bears or something, and they go swimming on New Year's Day.
Oh, that's the I don't know about New Year's Day, but there's a thing that people do called the polar plunge to raise money for like.
That's probably it.
Polar plunge is like you go in the like middle of winter. I guess it's the 1st of January or something like that. And you just run headfirst into the water and swim. I don't know. It's stupid. If you're gonna raise money to like ALS, I don't need to see you pour a bucket on your head. I'd rather you just donate the money.
Yeah, I get behind that, especially seeing some of the people who pour buckets on their heads.
Well, it's like attention seeking. I don't understand
It's
that
exactly attention seeking. It's absolutely attention seeking. Okay. Yes.
Just making sure we're on the same page.
We're on the same page. I can assure you I've never poured a bucket over my head.
What do you I would ask you, what do you think is missing about today's time through just the specific field of transplants or anything like that? What do you think is just a crucial element that seems to be dropped off?
I don't understand the question. What do you mean?
Well, like just like how I brought up in the beginning about how people don't really see a lot of these surgeries to the general public, and before it was an event, that's an element that's dropped off. What does that change? And what do you think that impacts today? I think that whole drop off of it going from entertainment, and the only thing besides now we have Facebook where people can be entertained by videos and stuff. I feel like that isolation or that disconnect from it for so long and so many generations growing up without having that type of entertainment or that open display of surgery, it creates a lot more squeamish people, a lot more people that are more likely to, when they see the sight of blood, faint. Now, is there any elements that you've noticed throughout your studies or throughout your work where you're able to see that there's a common correlation to that dropping off leading to a certain impact today? That's a good question. I'm glad I
That's
thought of
very
it.
interesting. Yeah, well done. All right.
1,000 something episodes, and I'm still figuring it out. No, just kidding.
No, that's a very good question. Okay, let's see what's dropped off. I have to sort of translate what you mean by dropped off.
People used to write on paper that was another person's skin. Think of that. What does
Yeah.
that mean? And now people use typing.
So what's dropped off? Well, and what's dropped off, and it's a good thing that it's dropped off, or what's dropped off and it's a bad thing that it's dropped off?
I think the like for instance, like the Nazis researching on human experimentation. There's still human experimentation that's going on now, but it's taken a different form. Instead of working on the physical, it now working more towards the mental. I brought up a case on here nobody believes me about. In 2020, this happened. During the pandemic, when everybody's worried about grandma, they were experimenting on kids with autism by giving them 39 to 87 shocks to the head to be able to try and fix their autism.
Oh, where was that?
This was in, I had to pull up. It's called, I looked it up on the show. Right? It's called Judge Rothenberg's case. It's been going on since 2011, but in 2020, they finally shut down. There was I mean, it's horrible. There was a kid with like a bipolar disorder, and they shocked that kid 70 something times. And it was,
Wow.
and the kid was young, but it's like, this is still going on today. People are human experiment. Now, I'm okay with human experimentation to a point. I think when you're doing psychological tests, that's interesting because if you're not, I mean, psychologically can kind of hurt more than physically sometimes. But like a study, like there was an experiment where a guy paid a bunch of researchers to go into a mental institution, an insane place, and say, just try and convince them that you're not insane. And it showed you that the guards, even if you were a normal functioning person, they were just like, nope. Yeah,
Oh
that's what
yeah, I've heard
everybody
about that
says.
one.
It's
Yeah.
kind of like being a prisoner and telling the guard you're innocent. Even if you are innocent, the guard's not going to listen to you because that's what everybody says. And then after that experiment, the person, he goes, I'm going to do it again. And then the institution started making sure that they can thoroughly talk to people and see if they can are actually paying attention to the people, if they are insane or not, and showing symptoms rather than just dismissing them as such. That's an okay case study or experiment. But when you start getting into like torture in a sense, like that, I think has changed from in the past to like when the question I asked you, that has kind of changed in a sense from going to physical experimentation to being able to grow a limb on your head or something like that, to now we're in this point of like trying to figure out how we can break the mind, and is there an easy way to be able to heal it back up.
All right, so something that I think
It's a tough question.
it's a tough it's well, it seems to be one of those questions that if I think about it for a bit, I'll go, oh yeah, this, and this. And in fact, I'm sure when we finish this conversation, I'll go, oh God, I should have.
Well, I just took two of the best examples you could probably use, and I'm sorry for that, but I thought of them, so I was like, I gotta say it.
Well, something that hasn't dropped off, something that people think of as new, but is actually something that hasn't dropped off, to use your term, I think would be the commodification of body parts, is selling them. Right at the start of the modern world, basically, in the 18th century, right at the start, you had body parts being sold. So you had them being sold for all kinds of reasons, for most famously for teaching aids. That's where you get all of those, or many of those body parts in jars, those wet specimens that we talked about earlier, but also in the form of teeth for transplantation. So you get these markets in body parts emerging right at the where markets themselves, where modern sort of mass markets start to appear. You already have body parts in that mix of things that are bought and sold.
Do you think that the value's gone up or down?
Of body parts?
Yeah.
Well, the value of life has, I'd say, gone up, and therefore the value of body parts has gone up.
I'm about to say I'm starting. I think it's more like it's probably the same thing, but I feel like just with our prices on things have kind of changed and fluctuated. Like 25 cents was a gallon of gas before. Now it's $4 over here. So it's like, I think it's that type of thing, but your eyes are like $30,000. Your kidneys are only
Oh,
8 grand a
yeah.
piece. Like it's just, there's a whole list of, I forgot, I saw the picture a long time ago, but they put all the prices of your body parts because during the pandemic times were getting tough. I was like, yo, but I feel like people now value their organs more than they probably did back in the day. You know what I mean? Like it just seemed like with science and the medical innovation being so like kind of brand new in a sense or age breaking, there's just a lot of people like, well, eventually when you're 20 or 30, you're going to lose all your teeth anyway. So it's kind of a sense of like, you might as well just like, we'll give you new ones. And it's like now people are trying their hardest to keep what they have. But even then, we're still losing teeth at like 40 and 30 years old. So,
well, didn't Hollywood, I'm not sure about the history exactly, but didn't Hollywood insist or strongly encourage their stars to have false teeth, completely false teeth in the earlier days, in the earlier 20th century?
not just that, they have contracts that wouldn't let you gain a pound outside of the weight class that you were hired for. I know plenty of my friends who are Universal Studios actors where they still have to maintain the
Wow.
same weight.
Wow. Oh God. That's quite
But then think about models. Models have completely changed. They used to throw up a Cheerio after they ate it. Now it's like you can be any size that you want, which is great. I'm so happy for that. But in a sense, we're like, it's weird how it hasn't lifted into other areas yet. Like, why do people get mad when Tom Hardy's like put on a little bit of weight? You know what I mean? It's like strange how society chooses to be like, I want to see my models be any size, but I want my TV actors to be nice and thin or play the part. Honestly, if you are playing Abraham Lincoln, you should look like fucking Abraham Lincoln. Like, I don't want to see a random like I don't want to see Gary Busey acting like Abraham Lincoln. Actually, that might be entertaining. Dude, Gary Busey, get on it.
yeah, I'm quite open when it comes to who plays what. Yeah, I wouldn't mind an Abraham Lincoln who doesn't look like Abraham Lincoln. It would presumably bring out new facets of the character.
Well, he was a vampire hunter, so
I see why they call you a conspiracy theorist.
no, that's the movie. There was Abraham Lincoln, vampire hunter.
Oh right, okay. Oh, again, this is Netflix.
Vampires aren't fucking real.
What? Netflix seems to be this massive cultural phenomenon that's completely passed us by.
It's not even on Netflix. It's not even on Netflix.
Is it not? It's
just it came out when that movie Lincoln came out. Remember that movie?
Oh, right.
They literally came out at the same time in this where I saw it in theaters, and I was like, why would I go see an actual thing about Abraham Lincoln? I want to go see the one where he's chopping vampires up. That does not make any sense.
No, I have embarrassingly little knowledge of films.
Digging through the past.
Well, it's even more embarrassing than that because I made my living for the last 12 years maybe as a filmmaker, as well as being a historian. So I had my
Is Spare Parts getting a movie?
Well, if someone wants to buy the rights to it, yeah.
If I had money, I would.
Well, let's hope someone does.
Because I know you got to be great at trivia night when they toss out like death facts or something that you're like, did you know that this first happened in this time period? That's what I enjoy about people is when they have a bunch of information about something that's so like odd off compared to the general public. Like a lot of people love politics talk. I like that too. But I also like the interesting fascinations throughout history that seem that people really don't get a chance to observe. Like, do you honestly, if you, from your experience, do you think that this should be taught in schools? Like, do you think people should have a better education of like this type of medical innovation? Like, there should be a medical history as like a class, not just more of like, I mean, they focus on history, but everything always deals around the Greeks and Romans.
Well, it depends where you are. I think it is taught in schools.
Nope.
I mean, this longer history that I've written is not taught in schools, and I think maybe parts of it should. You should, for instance, with the embroiderer, you should, as a school child, you should be exposed to um, characters and people who've changed history who don't fit into that, you know, white European man mold, and who maybe changed history in ways that you don't necessarily usually consider, like through embroidery.
Well,
There are new stories that can be told that can diversify someone's education. But I think that history of medicine, history of transplant surgery is taught in schools.
it wasn't really popularized over here. I haven't. I mean, maybe if you went to a college, but like the regular, I guess they're just trying to teach you the basic template of stuff. But I still feel like
Mm,
you really want to get people inspired about being a human species rather than just focusing on the country that you're in. Like, I like to learn about everybody's history, and that really
mm,
kind of resonates with me more if people say it's our history. Like, yeah, people forget at times that we're all one species in a sense, rather than a bunch of races or a bunch of different countries. Now, that's not saying that if you want to use that as like your profile thing of like, I'm this type of person, that's fine. That's okay. Good. If you want to try and use that to your benefit, do it. But I also like to think of a more human aspect of things where if it's
mm,
one thing throughout history, like, oh, that innovation was from France. It was a human being that did that though, as a human species. That's amazing that we even someone had a thought about doing that.
mm, mm. Yeah, I'd go along with that.
Like when someone
Yeah.
gets their arm blown off, who was the person like, we can attach another arm to it? You're like, what? What are you talking about? My arm is gone. It's like, it's okay. We can get you a better one. Do you want a chimpanzee's arm? You're like, what? Yes, we're going to give you a giant gorilla arm so you can punch people and it'll work.
It'll work. I like
It'll
that.
work.
It'll work.
You just
They
have to
used, well,
think it's
one
going
of
to
the
work.
well, but was it 1690s? I think a dentist in Yorkshire, in the north of England, suggested that you could transplant gorillas' teeth to humans because it would be cruel to transplant children's teeth. But a gorilla's teeth would be fine. Where you get a gorilla in 17th century Yorkshire, though, I don't know.
Why do they always start with teeth? Is that because it's like easy to work with rather than if you're working with
Yeah,
someone's like toes and fingers?
well, toes and fingers, I suppose. There are so many stories about toes and fingers and noses and things sort of magically being reattached. And actually, there could be some truth in those stories because you are just, if you encourage blood to flow from your body into a body part that's been recently detached, you can reattach it. So there might be some truth in a lot of those stories, but I forgot where I was going with that.
Well, give me a finger story.
The finger story.
It's going to make me cringe. So I'm just warning you.
I don't think I know a finger story off the top of my head. There
Like,
will be some though.
okay. Like someone that stuck their hand in like a bagel slicer and it just sliced off one of their fingers. Because I feel
Yeah,
like if you lose the
yo,
ring finger,
yeah.
you're
I mean,
screwed.
these days, there are loads of finger stories. If you can look them up easily enough. I
I
don't
had
know
a
any specific ones.
my I think it was my vice principal. She was a vice principal or some type of assistant principal. She was missing her third finger on her hand.
Hmm.
And I asked, and I was like, I was in fifth grade. I was like, what happened to your finger? And she was like, um, I was tying off a boat and the rope wrapped around her finger and the boat went off. And instead of pulling her, it just finger popped right off.
Ah,
And I was like, what? Like that can happen?
that scarred you, didn't it?
Probably. It was fifth grade. It was tough.
Yeah, well, you have this thing about hands. You said, what do you remember? Any other sort of hand popping or distorting or destroying incidents in your
I've seen a lot of
childhood?
playing sports. I see a lot of people that got their fingers jammed and they take that finger and pop it, like they put it in and pull it out like it's one of those things you get your Chinese finger bindings where you get your
Oh
fingers
yeah,
stuck.
yeah, yeah.
That always just freaked me the hell out because these things are so flimsy. I'm like, you could easily like. There are times I sleep on my like hand wrong, and next thing you know, all my fingers feel curved to the left or to the right. I'm like, well, it hurts, but oh, they'll just bend back. It's like, what are you talking about? Like my toes, I don't
What?
give a shit, but fingers, it's like something
What?
different. I
You
have long
hang
fingers,
on, hang
bro.
on. We can't just brush over that. What you slept on your hand and your fingers changed shape?
So you know how people's like fingers kind of like see how mine goes straight?
Yeah.
I've slept on them where the whole thing of my fingers were curved, like it looked like it had a bend to it,
Really?
and they just went back.
Right. Okay. Well, I've never come across that.
It's like if you sleep on your hands wrong. I remember hearing that when I was a kid, but maybe I was like, that's the issue also, is like I broke my arm when I was little. And
Oh, see, so there's actually a whole history here of hand and arm.
well,
Um,
no, I just remember what the doctor told me. He was like, since you're growing still, that's going to hurt a lot. And I was like, what do you mean? He was like, your body's going is in like its foundational moments. I was like 7 or something like that. He was like, you're growing into like, your knees ever hurt? I was like, yeah, my knees hurt. Like in the middle of the night, I'll get sharp pains. He goes, growing pains. He goes, your body's literally growing. You're like a machine right now. It's why you can eat whatever you want to eat, basically. And he goes, the issue with having a broken limb at that young is that it needs to be make sure you're taking care of it properly, or it's going to grow in the wrong way. Now, either he was trying to scare me or whatever, but I mean, my arm sometimes when it rains, it hurts. It's just that arm
when it
when
rains,
it rains. Just like an old man that goes, "Oh, my knees hurt when it rains," and I'm like a storm's coming, and he'll like say something like that. Like my arms like that as well too. When it rains or when it's like something that looks like it's about to like thunderstorm really bad, I get a sharp pain close to like my like in my forearm, but closer to my elbow, and I
where do
don't
you
know what that
consider
is.
your soul to be?
My soul,
Yeah, or yourself,
my people
Where
call.
do
Yeah, I've heard people call me an old soul before, but I don't know what
yo?
that is.
People call me an old soul as well, but they tend to be flaky hippie types.
I usually get it from older folks that are like, you have a lot of wisdom, and I'm like, for what? You want to hear me talk about the government? That'll make me seem like a child. I go so deep into it. Um, I don't know. I guess the main question I could ask, or the perspective that I'm kind of hearing in my head right now, is like, what do you think the soul is?
Well, I'm just thinking about if you feel the storms coming in your arm. That's quite interesting to me. Well, we obviously a lot of for a lot of history, many cultures have seen the self to be in the heart, haven't they, or the head? But what it just reminded me when you tell me about the arm that I think it's a Polynesian tribe once upon a time used to be convinced that they were in their testicles. And
People?
that's because, yeah, themselves, their I, so to speak. So they'd lower themselves. So it's a water based culture. So on canoes and things, fishing. And in order to sense the current of the water, they'd lower their balls onto the bottom of the boat and feel where they and because they had this ability, this sensitivity in their bollocks, they felt that they were in their bollocks. Perhaps you're in your arm in that sense.
I don't know. My balls are pretty sensitive too.
Can you can you ascertain what the current is like
No, but I can
in
place
a
them.
given waterway?
I can place them on someone's forehead and be able to predict their future. Oh,
Well,
that was perfect.
this let's end there.
Oh no, we gotta lighten it up a little bit. I think honestly, you said something important, which is what I've heard from a doctor explain to me before, and it kind of changed my perspective on where the soul lies. And the
Hmm.
soul, I wouldn't say is necessarily in your chest. I think it's in your head. And the way that he described it to me was, I can change anything in your body besides your brain. A moment someone messes with your brain, you are completely different. And I'm like, yeah, you can take my heart out and give me a new heart. It's still Robbie. But if you touch my brain, you can't give me a new brain. and it wouldn't still be me.
But would it still be Robbie if someone took your heart out?
Probably. How many
Well,
people have heart transplants and then change?
They do. Well, in fact, that people have heart transplants and then they're, it's horrible actually, but the family of the donor send, in some cases, I've been told, send birthday and Christmas cards and presents to their dead relative's body part. Of course, the person receiving it isn't that dead relative, but yeah.
Yeah, but I meant like personality change. Like if I gave you a new heart, would you still be Paul or would you be somebody else?
Possibly, because, I'm not a scientist. I don't know how to talk about this, but I do know there are some kind of neuron-like parts of the heart. So it's possible, actually.
I don't know.
The heart does think.
Yeah, but does it? When we say the words think, when you say think, are you saying that while thinking it through your head, or are you thinking it through your heart? I feel like the heart's where you feel. I think your thoughts are what people base your personality off of.
I don't think it's clear what the distinction between thinking and feeling is necessarily.
I think emotion has overtaken thought in a sense, because more people are just acting out of what they feel is right rather than thinking through of what the actual truth is. I think that's what gets us in a lot of bad situations. But when we say a person's personality, we don't look at that from the basis of their heart. We look at that at the basis of what we've seen them do actions wise. And everyone knows that actions are caused by the brain sending signals. So I feel like if you just change like your brain, like I know someone, there's a foreign accent syndrome. You ever heard of that?
Yes, I have. Yes.
That's a brain thing. If you hit your head, I mean, another one of my fears is like if I fell backwards and hit my head really hard, not only are you going to feel the front of your teeth like porcelain, feel like they're going to get fallen out of your head, but you can lose your sight because your sight is that back part of the brain. There's been people that have hit their heads really hard on concrete or something and have gone blind. Now that's scary in its own, but that's not a basis of, you can get hit in the chest as hard as you can. Your heart might stop, you might die, but you're not going to lose your sight. You're not going to lose other functions of your body. But if you like take someone's brain out and put it back in, the worst thing I've ever heard of that you can do is just cut into the head. Open up the head at all, because you're not going to be the same person once that happens. Your body's a little bit different. You can get your gallbladder taken out and you'll still be eating ice cream the next day. Your brain, though, there's just something different where Roseanne, you remember Roseanne?
Roseanne, the comedian?
Yes, the comedian. She had her own show and everything.
Yes, I remember. She was
hit by a car.
Was she really?
Yeah, she was hit by a car when she was a child.
Right, okay.
She used to be a student, shy, never said a peep. Then she was ran over by a car, like full on, like ran over, and everything changed after that.
Wow, that's amazing. I do remember Roseanne. Yeah, it's obviously I'm not American, but it seemed to be that and Ellen. I remember Ellen and Roseanne being sort of, they were always on.
That's a book you need to write about.
And Columbo was always on too.
That's a book you need to write about, is Ellen, how she's apparently drinking baby's blood. What's with baby's blood? You ever find that through history where someone was drinking the blood of a child?
Yes. The first kind of blood transfusion, or reported kind of myth of blood transfusion, is about a pope whose name, which pope I've forgotten, it's in the book, but I didn't prepare this because you asked me not to.
They're all Pope Francis, so.
No, this one's, no, I'm not going to look it up. You can buy the book if you're interested, ladies and gentlemen.
Sell them more. Spare parts, everybody.
That's right, yeah. Spare parts. That's right. But he was getting old, and his doctor thought that a way to cure him of his age was to give him children's blood. So he bribed a few children and bled them out. And
when did bloodletting start? Because people do that for like medical procedures to reduce inflammation at times too.
They still do it, yeah. Phlebotomy. for very specific purposes. I mean, it's hard to give a date for that because it's it's mentioned in some of the oldest literature that is just
Like,
many thousands of years old, Hippocratic things.
did you ever explore the realms of what happens, why people are so obsessed with sacrificing when it always comes to a heart? Seems like hearts have kind of been like the ones, even though it gets mixed in with religion in a sense too, but like the heart is always the thing that's always the prize objective in a lot of like sacred temples or sacrificial things. That might go back a little bit farther than.
I suspect it's got something to do with the heart being traditionally seen as the seat of the soul. I know blood has been shed in lots of rituals as a sort of a similar reason, a life-giving. Some tribes used to, I've forgotten which part of the world. It's in my book. But some tribes used to sprinkle blood on their crops to encourage them to grow because they felt that the life would help the crops grow.
Do you think that has a LinkedIn with like, we talked about transferring a lamb's blood into a madman? Do you think that has a link with like UFO stuff where they talk about cattle mutilations? Do you think like that's a concept, like maybe someone was trying to explore something religious or sacrificial in a sense?
What, back in the 17th century?
I mean, all throughout history, there's been cattle mutilations or things where they try and find a beast and there's no beast. So they chalk it up to some other type of weird phenomena or something like that. I wonder if that's just someone who's diving into like the dark arts, which is still happening today. I mean, Freemasonry has a goofy side to it that is linked in with like reading spells and shit.
Freemasonry seems to, from my perspective, seems to be a load of elderly gentlemen from small towns doing charitable work of different kinds.
That's what I had the leader of one of the lodges in the UK on the show. His is more
Ah,
his is more like serious, like more of like a group of buddies hanging out and getting dinner and all that. But there is a goofy side to the Masonic Freemasonry, which likes to think that they can read these old style spell books and be able to conjure something. But that's like that with
oh,
anything.
interesting. I didn't know that.
Like with our type of conversation with this one, you could have easily went on a show that was more scripted, more interview-ish, more all this type of stuff, and more narrowed down. But I'm more of the fun side in a sense, depending on if you had fun or not.
I'm having great fun,
Okay,
and it's all down to the host, Rob Robertson.
thank you. But it's not about me; it's about you. But I think that's with
Oh, I
anything.
beg to differ. What I can tell you where the blood transfusion thing comes from with the animals, and it's not to do with UFOs. I mean, there might be some fringe somewhere that, that felt there was some supernatural component, but it's blood transfusion in. Oh, hang on, sorry. Oh, I thought I heard my wife claim, but no. Blood transfusion in the 17th century comes the idea behind blood transfusion comes from ancient Roman and Greek literature. So the idea that blood, again, stands for life and youth, and that the myths that Ovid had written about blood making its way from a young person into an elderly person, and that elderly person transforming. And it's this idea that if you put blood inside you, you will transform in some very, very important way into whatever that blood has come from. So if you have young blood, you'll transform into a young person. If you have cat's blood, you'll transform into someone who doesn't have epilepsy. So it's a cure for epilepsy, which was called falling sickness back then in the 17th century. And I think that they thought cat's blood would work because cats always fall on their feet. I don't know, actually, but there's some kind of essential characteristic that makes its way from the animal to the person. So the sheep were used, the lambs were used because they were calm, so they'd be used to treat insanity. Calves were used to treat age.
Calves?
Young cows.
Yeah. Wow. I wonder. That's interesting to me because I
And
always
I think ox blood is supposed to cure dysentery, but I'm not quite sure why.
because I always when you look at like especially in Chinese culture traditions, there's a lot of like year of the ox and year of the chicken, and it's associated to a certain characteristic about that animal. And I think there's been that primal thing inside of us all. I mean, the Native Americans are our best examples of it when it comes to spirit animals or things that you can link with. And I always wondered that. Like, I just feel like if it changes you in a sense, like if you're transferring blood or just consuming something so much, do you start adopting those characteristics?
The interesting thing about the lamb's blood is that it looked like it worked. It doesn't work. Let me just be clear about that. But it looked like it worked because you're treating madness, and actually your body can take a little bit of blood that is incompatible. You wouldn't like it, and it can't take very much, and you'd have a massive fit, and you'd really, really tire yourself out. But when you tire yourself out, you've not got the energy to be mad. So it looks like it's actually worked, that it's been a cure for your madness. And then eventually you recover and you become raving again. And then you just need a top up. So it looks like it works for some of these things, but it doesn't.
Did you ever, there's a disease out there that you can only get from eating a person's brain tissue, and it's a lot like how they discovered mad cow disease when they were
Oh,
feeding
right.
they
I
were
don't know
feeding
about this.
cows to other cows, and cows were going insane because it's like cannibalism in a sense. There were people in other cultures that were just so insane they thought they were hostile. In a sense, they weren't. I mean, they were hostile, but they were just insane because what happens is you can only get this one of like I think three different ways, and two of the ways, one's from eating brain tissue and one's from eating spinal tissue. When you eat the same genetic lineup or coding of yours, human spinal tissue or human brain tissue, you go insane. And it's the same thing as mad cow
Oh, I
disease.
didn't know, but I'd never heard this. Yeah, there should be a Netflix film about it.
That's funny. We're going to make a Netflix film about spare parts. But I got one question and then we're going to wrap it up. Have you ever dived into the ancient realm? The ancient Egyptians dealing a lot with mummifying people and the type of I guess preserving of bodies in a sense.
Indirectly, there's a story it's a blood transfusion era, so this is 17th century. There's a pirate, a French pirate, who became a physician, and he became a physician because he was disgusted by one of the treatments at the age, which was to eat Egyptian mummies. So you nibble on
aged 1,000 years.
Yes, vintage. You'd nibble on a mummy's toe or something, or its liver, or whatever. Not liver, because that had been disintegrated, wouldn't it? But you'd nibble on a bit of mummy, or you'd ingest a bit of its powder, and it would cure you of all kinds of things. And he was just disgusted by this, and he thought that if doctors can bring themselves to sell bits of mummy, they can easily bring themselves to sell body parts, and that terrified him. So he became a sort of anti-transplant voice. But what he actually witnessed was the construction, as it were, of new mummies. So people who had died from diseases recently were being mummified and sold as ancient mummies for ingestion in the West.
Yeah. I just keep thinking back, if you're trying to eat a mummy, it probably has to taste something like jerky.
I think it would be quite dry. You'd need some kind of seasoning.
Jerky's dry.
Yes, I believe it is, but I think it would be less tasty.
I'm gonna agree with you. I can't find any flaws in that argument.
I mean, actually, you can probably get a similar treatment in certain traditional medical systems nowadays. So if you wanted to try a kind of mummy, I bet you could lay your hands on some.
Well, there's people that smoke other people's ashes.
Yeah. Oh, I've got a. Probably this is
Do it. All right, come on, tell me it. I want to hear it. I want to hear
too
it.
long. But I've got a friend who's in New York, an artist called Haida Hatchery, and she's amazing. She's very, very, very clever, and she had this project where she'd paint with the ashes, with someone's ashes, and she'd paint their portrait. It's just chilling to see.
Oh my
She showed me.
goodness.
I was in her apartment in just near Central Park a few years ago, and she's showed me a portrait she'd painted of her father, and she said, "This is my father." And I said, "Oh, that's nice." And she said, "No, this is my father." It actually is him. I
Oh
used
my
his ashes.
God. I wonder
Haida Hatchery, look her up.
if it was a self-portrait of her father, that would be cool. But if it was like just like it's a bird or a sunrise that I did with my father's ashes, it's like, did your father like sunrises? No, he hated them. It's like, then why the hell did you make him into one?
No, it's a picture of him.
Oh,
Oh, it's so chilling to see. Look at. I've forgotten the name of. I forget a lot, you know.
it's okay.
I live in the moment. But if you search Haida Hatchery, Haida, not Heidi, you'll find that project. It's very interesting. There's a lot of interesting woman. She also had a project where and this is how we met actually. She had a project where she was constructing sculptures of people from pig skin. And I was doing a lecture in New York at the Observatory Gallery. It was 2011, I think it was. And she wanted to come and see it because she was interested in skin grafting. And she couldn't come for some reason or another, but we met up and we got on so well. And she told me that she said, I discovered this project because my husband cheated on me with my daughter's girlfriend, and so I made a portrait. I made a model of his face with pig skin, and I found the right kind of blue eyes, and it looked just like him. And she was going to set the dogs on it for a kind of revenge, but it rotted. But I discovered this is a very good material for art. And that's how she started with pig skin. Yeah, interesting woman, Haida. Look her up, everybody.
I was just gonna recommend a therapist. Good God, you could take your problems out another way. But Paul, you've given me enough of your time, man. It's a great 30 minutes chatting with you. It was a great 30 minutes.
It's a very good 30 minutes times.
No, it's been like 2 hours.
Bit.
But Paul, it's been a pleasure, man. I'd love to have you back on the show. But where can people find spare parts? Where can people find any of your links, your Twitter?
Oh, yes. Well, I have a Twitter, which if you're gonna tweet, they'll find that Twitter. Spare parts should be available in May in North America at all good bookstores. And of course, Amazon and all those places. And it's available in the UK now. So, yeah, and it'll be available in Poland and Turkey. And I've got a contract in Russia, but I don't know if that's going to go ahead.
That's not going through. That's not going through.
Oh, no, I don't think it will. So perhaps not in Russia, but the other places.
Well, I'll link it all in the description. I appreciate you doing the podcast.
Thanks, Robbie. Thanks for having me.
And thanks for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank.